Today marks the beginning of a series of scripted segments devoted to detailing the history of the evils of government. My first story details the all-too-common scenario of how some policies with the best of intentions only perpetuate the evils that they claim to attempt to end. This first story deals with a eugenics policy that existed from the late 1800s to the mid-1970s. This is a story of ugly laws. In 1916, a Portland woman called Mother Hastings was told by authorities that she was, quote, too terrible a sight for children to see. The LA Times reported in 1917 that her crippled hands had disgusted members of her community, and she was given money to leave town. She complied, but sadly, Los Angeles was considering enacting their own version of this law that had restricted her access to urban space in Portland. Ugly laws were municipal statutes in the United States that outlawed the appearance in public of people who were, quote, diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, end quote. That was verbatim from the Chicago City Code of 1881. These laws targeted those with disabilities, the homeless, and vagrants, and were actively enforced and written from the American Civil War to World War I. And they were part of ideas which had become popular during the Progressive Era. That included forced sterilization and the beginning widespread normalization of the eugenic procedure of abortion. Forced sterilization continued in the United States until the early 1990s, and of course, abortion continues to this day in certain states. The first of these laws came about in San Francisco in 1867 to, quote, prohibit street begging and to restrain certain persons from appearing in streets and public places. But the words to describe people as, quote, disgusting objects were common in laws that were spread as far and wide as Portland, Denver, Lincoln, Omaha, New York, Manila, and Reno. The entire state of Pennsylvania even enacted such a law in 1891. Now, the laws were mainly meant to prevent people with visible disabilities from hanging out in public spaces or asking for money, but of course, the wording and function, just like the sterilization laws, gave power and license to those with sinister intent. Of course, being ugly was only a crime if you were poor. There was never any attempt to uniformly enforce the laws. There was only a want to have a pretext with which to remove people from public spaces if their presence offended those in power. It wasn't until the 1970s, after a man was arrested in Omaha for violating an ugly law, that the push started for the Americans with Disabilities Act. Ugly laws would be the pretext for government to step in and do something to prevent these horrible acts of discrimination against the poor, disabled, and sick. It became a legend at that time to spread the idea that the laws had begun in Chicago, aimed at preventing those in P.T. Barnum's freak show from eating at diners or otherwise being in public. But ugly laws had existed for far longer than the famous freak shows, whose entertainers absolutely suffered discrimination at the hands of these ugly laws. Disability activists used stories like these to demand the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and in 1990, it was signed into law by George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, the law, in theory, provided protections to those with disabilities similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But in a completely predictable move, the ADA, as it is known, has been weaponized by governments against the very people that it was meant to protect. In Portland, Oregon, civic representatives now use the ADA to chase off beggars. The, quote, sidewalk management plan was pushed by then-Mayor Sam Adams to create a, quote, pedestrian use zone with a justification basis in the ADA. The claim, of course, is that beggars and homeless people are obstructing passage on the sidewalks, and the ADA gives them the legal ability to persecute the poor and the homeless. Now, in an ironic twist of fate, the law that was passed and meant to protect people like Mother Hastings would now be used against people just like her. Now, it's a natural impulse to wish to have orderly and clean streets, but the reliance on the belief that government can solve the problem that government creates is naive. The laws are aimed at punishing homeless, not providing handicapped people with more space to maneuver on sidewalks, because Portland's sidewalks are littered with sandwich boards, magazine racks, cafe tables, and all sorts of other obstructions. And yet none of those were targeted as needing to be moved, only ugly people who are too poor to defend themselves. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed with the best of intentions, and by bleeding heart Republicans calling themselves compassionate conservatives. And of course, those who oppose the ADA or who think it even now tends to do the opposite of what it claims are painted as heartless. Much like the Patriot Act and Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act is named in such a way as to make anyone who might oppose a law out to be some kind of unpatriotic or unfeeling monster. And of course, like the Inflation Reduction Act, the ADA is being used to do the opposite of what it claims to fix. In reality, the government has, and always seems to be, the true monster and threat to our natural rights.